Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptive podcast. And today I've got Jennifer with us, Jennifer Rose Asher. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, delighted, absolutely delighted. Always a pleasure to talk to somebody passionate about adoption. What comes to your mind when you hear this phrase, thriving adoptees?
Well, I have two children who were adopted. And so that's what initially comes to my mind when I hear that word is I think of my kids because I think that they are thriving. They're 18 and 21, and they're both happy and healthy and doing great and on their way to great careers. And that's what comes to mind when I hear that
Yeah,
phrase.
yeah. Uh, that's great. I love that. I love that. I got told yesterday, I was talking to an adoptive mum yesterday who has been on the podcast, and I've also done some speaking work with her. Um, she works with an organisation that supports adoptive parents. And she said, Simon, and I thought she was going to give me a criticism, but essentially, she said, you're a little bit different to most adoptees, and you seem to be, you come on all bouncy and bright, and I thought, I thought, oh dear, am I kind of like too much, right? But I thought, how could that be? How could that be? And people say, yeah, you seem very positive about adoption, Simon. And I say, yes, I am. And then I'm kind of waiting for a question, and most of them won't ask a question, but I kind of just jump in, and I say, well, the reason I'm positive about it is because we are not our trauma. No person is the trauma that they've been through, or even the trauma that they're feeling right now, or that they're traumatic thoughts going right through their head. So I believe that we should be really. There's lots of people talk about being trauma informed,
Mhm.
and I agree with that. But I think the world has become kind of trauma obsessed, and so I think my philosophy really is trauma informed and hope obsessed. Um, and and I guess also, if we think somebody's ahead of us on the journey, uh, not to be, for me, if somebody's ahead of me on the journey, I want to learn from them rather than um, get pissed off that. Sorry, I don't usually swear on them.
Yeah.
Sorry, get cheesed off, then get cheesed off about the fact that they're ahead of me. But we seem to live in a trauma, kind of like a trauma obsessed world to me, and I don't think that does anybody any good, really.
It doesn't. And as soon as you said that, I don't know why this popped into my head, and I don't want to sound pretentious, but what came into my mind is the goal is for us to all be trauma transcendent and to move past that trauma and use it for good.
Okay. Um, so I love the word trauma transcendent, or phrase, and a normal podcast host would normally say, "Okay, so how do we do that?" And it's all this kind of. I don't know if you listen to many podcasts. Like, there's a couple that I stopped listening to because the guy keeps on just saying, "Well, how?" Would
Yeah.
just say how, and I'm just thinking, well, that's really reductionist. That like, oh yeah, so you're going to reduce it to 3 steps, are you, Simon? Simon, okay. There's five ways to transcend trauma. It doesn't look like that. It doesn't. It isn't. It isn't something that is so um,
Well, it's not
simple
cut
and
and
facile.
dry.
Sorry.
It's not cut and dry, but I think that you could ask how. And I think the answer to how, although it's a little bit reductionist, the answer is a little bit vague because it differs for everyone. And I think the answer to how is to be open to understanding the trauma, do your best to kind of live through the emotions and experience the emotions, and then examine where those are coming from, where those emotions are coming from, understand where they're coming from, and ask how that can be useful to you. How can I use the understanding of this trauma and how it affected me and use that to help me?
Okay.
An example of that, to kind of distill it down and use an example. If you are, if someone were to be in a shooting situation, and then they would hear trauma whenever they heard loud noises, um, or not trauma, but to be, um, very upset, very triggered when they hear loud noises. Okay, the first thing is to understand, why do I hate loud noises so much? Oh, it reminds me of that time when I was in that shooting. And then to take that and use it and say, okay, loud noises scare me. It's good to know that. Number one, I can prepare for that. If I'm going somewhere where I know that there's going to be loud noises, I can bring earplugs and be prepared for it. And I can also prepare myself for it mentally and say, look, I'm going to this concert. It's going to be really loud. There's going to be loud noises, but remind yourself and understand, this is a good thing. This is a concert. It's music. It's something that's bringing people happiness. So loud noises don't always have to be bad. And to try to allow your mind to understand and connect that positive experience with those loud noises to kind of dampen that effect from the loud noises.
Okay.
And it's a really simplistic example, but and nothing's ever quite that easy, but it's just the idea of it. And let's figure out a way to have a positive experience to pair with those non loud noises in and of themselves aren't necessarily bad. So it shouldn't be that excuse me, a loud noise necessarily brings about a negative reaction. So allowing that to have a positive reaction, allowing yourself to feel a positive reaction in a response to that loud noise can kind of diminish that effect.
Okay. So far, so rational.
Sorry, I'm a rational being.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll go with this, right? I'll go with this because my own experience has been a little less rational, shall we say? So
Well, and it's never quite so rational when you're living in it and when you're upset by it and when it's something that really affects you in a strong way.
yeah,
When it's something that, I mean, I say this like it's like you said, so rational. Well, if I was in a mass shooting or something, it wouldn't be, oh, I'm sorry, loud noises affect me, but it takes time and it's a process. It's not quite so simple, but that example is just a simplified example.
yeah. Okay. So how does that simplified example, how does that look for you in the adoption experience rather than the gunfire setting?
Well, the I'm not an adoptee. I'm an adoptive parent.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, but for my kids, number one, I try to always be there. The biggest thing is to be there and talk through the experience. So if one of my kids were coming to me and saying, this situation is really upsetting me, I might say to them, okay, well, let's try and distill down, why is this situation really upsetting you? Let's look at it. What about it is really upsetting you? And again, to kind of take a typical adoption scenario, and this hasn't necessarily happened with my own kids, but to take a typical feeling from adoption would be feelings of abandonment and feeling and not being able to trust that someone is going to be able to come back. So if you had a young child who was adopted, who knew they were adopted and had feelings of abandonment, if they came to you and said, Mommy, it makes me so sad every time you come to work, you could to kind of go through that and say, I understand it makes you sad. It makes me sad too, when I go to work. But let's talk about, why does that make you sad? And are you worried that I'm not going to come back? And they might say, again, especially if it's a very young child, yes, I'm worried you might not come back. And you just say, okay, well, let's look at your experience with me. Do I come home every single day from work? Even when I go to work, do I come back every day? Yeah, okay, well, let's look at that. Let's talk about not how sad it is when I leave, but let's talk about what are we going to do fun when I come back from work? And what let's make a plan each day. What are we going to do? Even if it's a simple thing like I'm going to give you the biggest hug of the whole day when I come back from work, or we're going to, we're going to bake cookies after dinner. Whatever it is that day, even if it's just a big hug and a kiss, whatever, that we're going to attach with, oh, mommy, go to work so that you can hurry up and come home so I can have my great big hug, or so that we can make cookies. So again, kind of a simplified example, but it's all about being open to understanding the feelings that you're feeling, not negating those feelings, saying, yeah, I understand. Yeah, it's a sad thing. Let's figure out a way to make that happy. Let's
Yeah.
figure out a way that we can live through that sadness and go past it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So now I'm getting it. Thank you. Thank you. I always say that I'm better with examples than theory. And now going. I'm going to now figure forward on. Like if I'm talking to somebody else, I'm always better with an example that's kind of closer to the heart of the issue that we're looking at. So that's great, Jen. So you said that you that hadn't happened to you, that particular experience hadn't happened to you. So what are some of the insights from the experiences that you've been through as a mom and an adoptive mom, that have really helped you see how you can help your kids?
What the things that I've actually been through with my kids, and it's mostly my daughter. My son doesn't really talk about it nearly so much. So it's much easier to find fresh, real, true examples from my daughter.
Yeah.
Um, and she's a girl, she talks more. She's more kind of in touch with what's going on in her head. But when she was little, she used to worry about her birth mother, and she used to come to me and say, I'm worried about my birth mom. And she would use her name, which I don't want to use.
Of course.
But she would say, I'm worried about my birth mom. And I'd say, okay, well, what are you worried about? And she'd say, well, she heard that, and she knew that her birth mom was from Vietnam. And she said she heard that there were some bad things going on in Vietnam. And I was like, first of all, she's not in Vietnam anymore. She was born in Vietnam, so you don't need to worry about that. And then she would say, well, I'm worried she doesn't have enough money. And I'd say, well, you know what, honey, there's not really anything we can do about that. Hopefully, if she doesn't have enough money, she will be smart enough to figure out a way to get money. And she's really got a problem. We know her sister, who would be Hilary's biological aunt. We know her. If you'd like, we can call her and say, hey, do you know how Hilary's birth mom is doing? Her aunt is kind of a safe place. Hilary's birth mom, not that we don't ever talk to her, but it's a little bit more of an emotionally charged relationship, whereas her aunt is just a very nice, calm, wonderful lady who we love talking to. So especially when she was little, I would say, okay, well, let's look into that. I understand your worry, and not negating it and saying, oh, you don't need to worry about that. Because that wouldn't help her to live through that and get past it. So it was really important for me to acknowledge, yeah, I understand you're worried. Let's figure out how we can know what it is that you're worried about, and let's see if we can make you feel more comfortable with those concerns.
Okay.
And that really did happen, and we did call her aunt, her biological aunt, and she said no, she's doing well, she just got married, they had a baby.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's brilliant. First thing, listeners, is that I have heard what Jen said about girls talking more about this stuff than boys. I have heard that is the case, as a mass generalization. And as somebody that grew up with a little sister, so there's 3 years between your kids. There was there's 3 years between your kids. There's 2 years between me and my sister. My sister will be, yeah, well, I'll be 56 next time, and she'll be 54 next time. So, and from what I remember growing up, she didn't mention it a lot, but she mentioned it more to me than I probably never mentioned it to her. So, if you've got a boy who's not mentioning stuff, then that might be just part of this gender stereotype playing out, right, listeners? It may be, or it may not. Who knows? What sort of age was this happening at Jen?
Oh goodness, I think that conversation when she was about 6.
Right.
I think
Okay.
about
Okay.
6.
So it seems to me is you've you've got some kind of wisdom going for you, um, which allows you to essentially de-escalate. Is that the word? You're de-escalating the problem. You're just slowing everything. You're kind of slowing everything down to help her
Well,
slow herself down.
I think the biggest thing is, well, there's a couple of things. First of all, open communication is so important. And I've always encouraged my kids to talk to me about anything like this that they're worried about, that they're upset about, that they're sad about. Let's talk about it, and let's figure out how we can make you feel, get through those feelings, and feeling a little bit better. Um, but it's also really important to validate those feelings and say, it's okay. It's okay to be sad about that. It's okay to be sad about that you don't get to talk to your birth mom more often, or that she's not a bigger part of your life if you're sad about that, or that you're worried about her. So it's really important to validate those feelings and say it's okay to feel that way. And let's experience that together, and let's sit and talk about that, and let's figure out a way that you can experience that but then move past it.
Yeah.
So it's really important to let kids feel how they want to feel, and but to then a little bit dissect it and say, let's look at what's really making you feel that way, and see if maybe you don't need to be so sad about that.
Okay. Um, yeah, people say this open communication thing all the time. Um,
It's
it
so
seems to me
important.
that it seems to me that that's what you did. Like they you didn't just say you can talk to me about this stuff. They actually listened to you and did feel that they could do. Because I'm sure every mum and dad, whether they're adoptive mum and dad, or they're raising kids that they gave birth to, their own biological kids, if you like. They say that all the time. Like I'm sure my mum still says that to me all the time, but I don't always do it, right?
Of
There's a
course not.
difference
And
between
I don't either.
no.
but
So,
but when there's something like the adoption that may cause problems throughout their life, that you just know this is a way in which they're a little bit different from other kids, it was always important to me for that to just not be stigmatized, not be seen as something bad, just a part of who they were, and to really open those lines of communication. And I did that by writing each of them a book of their story, and I would read it with them when they were little. I wrote each of them before they were a year old. And we would sit and read their story when we did story time before they went to bed at night. That was just always one of the books that was an option. Not that we read it every night, but probably once a week or a couple times a month, we would pull out their adoption story. And it just made it a topic that was okay to talk about because we would read their story. So it wasn't anything hidden away. It was a book that was always on their shelf that we could read anytime, and it wasn't a secret, and it wasn't a problem, and it wasn't a bad thing. It was a wonderful, beautiful little book about how happy we were that they were a part of our family.
yeah. Interesting. The book that my mum and dad bought to explain adoption to me, that sat on my bookshelf all the way through. I don't know where it is now. Obviously I'm 56 next time, but I don't actually remember reading it, but I must have been read it, and I'm pretty sure I was read it before I could actually take in what was happening, and it really normalizes it. Like
Mm-hmm.
I often say this on the podcast, is that nobody likes shocks. Nobody likes nasty surprises or surprises that come in so nasty. So the earlier, like telling them before, so I think I mean what does the it's a long time ago, obviously, if your kids are 18 and 21. I mean, do people get trained, do parents get trained or told to tell their kids, wait to tell their kids before they can actually understand, um, conceptually, so not to understand, to actually write? Do they get told to wait until kids to get can understand it before they tell them? Do, have you got a
Um,
feel
I,
for that?
I don't know if I was told that. I somehow knew that. I know that I had a friend who had an adopted sister when I was very young. When I was in like second grade, I had this friend, and she had a sister who was adopted, and I don't think the sister found out until much later. And I think it was really upsetting. And we've all seen, there was a Friends episode about this, about a little boy who was told when he was like 8 years old and how upset he was. So I think I just kind of assimilated that in my own head and said, well, if they never don't know, if they always know that they're adopted, then it can never be a bad, it can never be
Yeah.
something to find out. And I think that's just the way it should be. Um, uh, so I think I just knew that. Now that's one of the things that I try to educate parents on whenever I have the opportunity, is to let them know, please tell your kids, the best time to tell your kids that they're adopted is today. um, because if they're born already, because it doesn't matter how young they are. Again, I wrote these books for my kids when they were a year old, or less than a year old, and I read them to them long before they had any understanding whatsoever of what this meant or what was going on. So it just was never a bad thing. It was never something to find out. It was just, oh, this other woman gave birth to me. Our family found, we came together, and that's how you joined our family. I mean, no kid, honestly, no kid when they're born grows up knowing, well, I grew in my mom's tummy. That's something that needs to be explained to them too. Um,
Yeah, of course.
because so many people, most people in the world grew in their mom's tummy. They find out eventually, kind of naturally, when they're very young, and it's never a big deal. And I wanted adoption to be the same way.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Um, were there any occasions when you felt that, stuff was being bottled up, that they weren't sharing with you?
Um, there's things with my son, that I think he's always had a lot of anxiety in his life. He's one of those kids that he worries about stuff. He worries about making the wrong decision. I tell a cute story about when he was about 6. We went to Baskin Robbins, which is an ice cream
Yeah.
shop around here. It's known called 31 flavors. So they're known for having a lot of flavors. And we went, and my other two kids picked their ice cream, and Jamie was sitting on the floor crying. And I was like, "What's wrong?" He's like, "I just don't know which one to pick." And um, so he's always been that kind of worrier, and worrying about making the right decision. And he has a hard time with decisions. I do the best that I can. I say to him, when he's struggling with something, I say, could this have anything to do with being adopted? Do you have any interest in talking to your birth mom? Do you want to talk about that? I'd like for you to think about if this could possibly be related. I don't want to force it, and he usually says, no, no. But hopefully, by asking the question, I'm putting the idea in his head, so that if that is having an effect on him, if that might be something that's even a contributing factor to a problem that he's having currently, that is something that he considers and that he thinks about.
Yeah. Yeah. I would have never. Yeah. Well, like me and my missus haven't got any kids, so yeah, this is off. Yeah, this is off my, what do they call it? this isn't my wheelhouse, this sort of stuff.
Yeah. Well, and I've tried, you and I've talked about that, this whole situation of these adoptees who have had some really upsetting feelings towards their adoption later in life, and sadness about being adopted when they're much older, has really come into my consciousness in the last year. So, particularly in the last year, I've tried even more to make sure that I ask that question if there's a problem. Again, I don't want to force it down his throat. I don't want to say everything is due to his adoption, because it's not. Everyone has all kinds of traumas that have happened through their life. But because this has been brought to my attention, I always try to ask the question. And even if, being an 18-year-old boy, his answer is going to be, no, mom, why do you always ask that?
Yeah.
Um, I figure, okay, if there's even a slight possibility that this could be having an effect on him, better to bring it to his attention, because it's something that, because I've always normalized it, I hope that if this is having some effect on what's going on with him now or at that time, that he can look at that and say, oh, maybe this is making these feelings stronger for me, and to kind of take that responsibility away from himself, that okay, this isn't just me, this isn't me being oversensitive, there's a reason maybe why this upsets me so much, and it's okay.
Yeah. Could I had some thoughts
Mm-hmm.
based on this sort of subject, just that happened to me yesterday, right?
Okay.
And so it's quite fresh for me, as in like it's not like a fully formed idea in my head. Um,
Okay.
but I just wanted to, I wanted to ask you if you're up for exploring.
Sure, of course.
I'm exploring this, right? And it may seem a bit esoteric, so I'm just um, as I say, I'm exploring it. I'm pretty sure where I'm going.
Okay.
I'm not. I'm not. I don't. I'm not sure enough of my logic to be able to
Okay.
go out on a limb and just say it. But it's just exploring, right? So I was listening to something from a guy by a guy on an audio book yesterday morning when I was walking the dog, like I do every day, and it wasn't anything to do with adoption, but it was to do with feelings. That was for sure, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he made a statement. Did this guy, and I really respect this guy and value what he has to say in the world. If anybody wants to know who I'm talking about, it's a guy called Rupert Spira, a British guy called Rupert Spira. Rupert, Rupert, Spira, Spira, right? And what I did was I transposed something that he said into an adoption context and that was relevant to me. So here's what I came up with. If adoption had made me unhappy, I'd always have been unhappy.
Oh, what a great thought. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So
Was
yeah.
his initial What was his original quote?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
I went straight to applying his kind of theory and a bit like you. You gave me that example, then I asked you for the example related to adoption. I can't remember I can't remember his example because I went to straight to the insight for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So why did that? Like I thought it was a little bit esoteric and a little bit philosophical, right? But you thought there was something in it. So what did you see in that?
Well, I guess it's like anything else. If adoption is just a part of who you are, if having been raised by a mother who was not the woman who gave birth to you was causing some problem. So say there's some problem you're having, just to be kitschy about it, like your tennis game stinks. You can't hit the ball. And you can say, well, maybe it's because I was adopted. And you could say, well, but I could hit the ball last week and I was adopted then too.
Yes. Yeah.
And so if that was the
Okay.
problem, if that was the problem, then then in when you were in the same situation and having the same kind of issue before, then that would be the problem. But
Yeah.
obviously there's something different that's causing you not to be able to hit the ball today. Then you have to isolate what's different that's causing the problem rather than what has always been.
Brilliant. I love it. I love it, and that is exactly that's kind of exactly where I went. Actually, that's where I was going. You've expressed what I was thinking, completely different way, which is brilliant. But it's the same thing. It's we know we're coming from we're yeah we're on the same lines.
Well, and that said, if the corollary of that may also be true, if you say, well, I've always hated this, I've always hated tennis, I've never liked it, or I've never liked a certain food, you may at that point say, well, I wonder for myself if this is something that's been consistent throughout my life that I've always had an aversion to, or that has always upset me. Well, maybe that's a good time to say, okay, well, could this be because I somehow am associating that with having about being raised by a biological mother, or the loss of my biological mother. So if it's a new feeling, if it's something that's new to you, then maybe then that wouldn't be something because you were adopted. But if it's something that's been a consistent issue through your whole life, then maybe it could be.
Yeah. So the thought that popped into my head as you were explaining the tennis one, and I love the way you describe it as kitschy. You were talking. You were also talking earlier on about the discussion we had last time when we chatted last time about what the bad experiences that some adoptees have, and what I actually see on Facebook groups is them a lot of the posts are as far fetched as the tennis game.
I agree
So,
with you.
my kitschy example is, I stubbed my toe on the bed head this morning. It's because I'm adopted, and I'm feeling really bad about it. And then what they say is how they sign off the message on the Facebook group. Um, does anybody else feel this way too? Right? And then
Yeah.
everybody jumps in and validates it. Everybody jumps in and validates it. So we've got this echo chamber going on in our heads that thinks X is the problem of Y, and then everybody tells us X is a problem of Y, and it snowballs. The problem grows because we think, oh yes, this is the truth. And so you talked about validating kids' emotions, but also I don't think you use the word questioning, but subtly repositioning it or tweaking it slightly, asking them questions, seeing if there's a different way, and that is an art. That must be an art. That when you validate, and when you gently question or coach, and it is a when, as in so right in the middle of the meltdown, you might do nothing at all, but you might validate later and then question after, and your wisdom, uh, your wisdom as an adoptive parent is going to guide you when to do that, when to validate, when to question, and when to coach about a change.
Well, and I think the correct word for that would be to examine and evaluate.
Okay.
So again, if you look at tennis, you can evaluate that and say, well, was I good at tennis last week? Well, if you've never been good at tennis, you might say, well, maybe this was because I was adopted. Me, I've never been good. I could never hit this darn ball. Well, maybe it's because my birth parents were not very athletically inclined, and neither am I.
Yeah.
um, and again, I do think And particularly, I think it is valid to examine certain situations, either if if a situation is a pattern, is consistent. Well, I've always had an issue with this, or this is something that I've always been overly sensitive about. But the other situation that is important to evaluate is if this is a brand new situation. Oh my gosh, I've never gone to college before, and I'm experiencing a lot of anxiety about it, and I'm really, really nervous about going away from home. Well, if this is a new situation, then I think it's perfectly valid to look at, well, could my feelings of abandonment or my missing my birth mom, um, missing that connection to family, be intensifying my feelings and my concern about going to live away to live at college.
Yeah.
So that's one of the ways that you can begin to evaluate, could this be a factor or not? Is this a new experience? Is this something, if it's not a new experience, have I had the same reaction in the past?
Yeah. So going back to this idea, then, if adoption had made me unhappy, I'd always been unhappy. So we're both saying that there's something there. To me, and I guess I'm asking you permission to explore this again. Really, there
Of
seems to
course.
be like a missing link.
Uh-huh.
So I'm drawing a little. I was as you were chatting, I was drawing a little. Well, I was writing some words down on the page, right? So on the left hand side, I've got past event, okay, and for this case, we're talking about the past event as adoption. And on the right hand side of the page, I've got um, feeling or maybe experience, and I've put the word current on top. So I've
Mm-hmm.
got past event
Mm-hmm.
and current feeling, and they're on the left and right, and they're on the left and the right hand side of the page, and then I put a question mark in the middle of the page. So I've got past event, question mark, current feeling, and it
Mm-hmm.
seems to me there is a kind of a missing link here between because the past event, the adoption, if I'd always if adoption had made me unhappy, I'd always been unhappy. I would have, my feelings have varied over time. So a, a historic event, fixed event, cannot uh, determine a varied experience.
Mm-hmm.
Am I being too wacko here?
um, no, and I think, I so to validate for adoptees who say, okay, having been adopted has always had an effect on their life. I think that's definitely possibly true. So sadness is something that's kind of hard to qualify and quantify and evaluate. But for example, if you're someone who's always been had a hard time being happy at events, then there is some validity to, okay, well, maybe having been adopted has has created this barrier to being able to feel happy. um, I think in general, something that may be more likely possible would be like being more sensitive. Like someone who is adopted, can go back to, well, um, having been adopted has always made me more sensitive to these things, or has always made me more withdrawn.
Yeah,
And that's okay, and especially if you're aware of it. I think it's always better to be aware. If it's something that you don't want to be aware of, that you don't want to deal with, that's okay. But I think you should even be aware that you don't want to deal with it.
yeah,
There are certain things that are issues for me, that are problems for me, that I'm aware of, but I'm making a conscious decision. You know what? I'm aware of this. I know it's a problem. I understand what I have to do to fix it. I'm not there yet. I'm not ready to deal with it. But it's really important for me to know that it's there. And when I'm ready to deal with it, I will deal with it. So it's not necessarily something that everyone's going to be ready to deal with. But at the same time, if you are, and just that awareness of, oh, I have social anxiety, I don't really like being in big crowds. I think maybe, whether it's from being adopted or not, knowing that is a good thing. It helps you plan your life. And if you have a night when you've got three different options of places that you've been invited, you can know, well, you know what, I don't always remember it, but in general, I'm not very comfortable in big crowds. Maybe I want to go to the event that's a little bit more, a smaller group.
Have you heard of something called, I think it's Occam's razor? Have you heard of that?
I have.
Yeah.
I'm not, it's not something I've studied recently, so you'll have to refresh.
Yeah. I've only heard it in passing. And all I've heard is that, the simplest, the simplest explanation is the one that's true. I think that's how it sums up. For me, I think that the the missing link between or the missing link that determines how we feel in any moment is what there's a guy called David Hawkins, who's no longer with us anymore. It was nothing to do with adoption, but he was a psychotherapist kind of guy. He was also quite a religious guy, and he created a scale of human consciousness. Scale of human consciousness, and it's got all the different emotions on it basically, and shame it goes from 0 to 1,000, and shame is 20. 0 is dead, and shame is 20. So and it goes up the way through sort of like anger, pride, happiness, unconditional love, and it goes right up to the top, like to the great religious avatars, Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, people like that. It goes from 0 to 1,000. And to me, that's that is our place on that scale is the reason for. Oh, sorry, just hold on. I'm just going to have to pause the recording a minute. Just on. Sorry about that, listeners. That was my wife at the back door because I'd locked her out of the front door.
Oh no. Don't do that.
Don't do that. I'd left my key in the lock. Sorry. So yeah, this scale of human consciousness, Jen was just asking who wrote it. It's a guy called David Hawkins. And to me, that's like a past event cannot, for me, cause a current experience. What is actually happening is we're going up this scale of consciousness. And why we're doing that, well, that's an unanswerable one for me. I have my knowledge that we're at the edge of my knowledge, the edge of my knowledge on this subject. But that's kind of my take on it. So talking about knowledge and self-knowledge, what would you say that you'd learned about yourself and you continue to learn about yourself, raising your kids now they're 18 and 21?
Well, the biggest thing I've learned is that I make a lot of mistakes, and and really, what I try to remind myself constantly is I can only move forward and I can't move backward. In fact, I had this discussion with my son only it was sometime in the past week, in the past few days. And he said, well, you're unfixable. You've always done this. And I've said, well, I can't change what's happened in the past. But if you don't tell me what the problem is, I can't change it moving forward. So I, yes, I'm pretty rigid. I'm pretty set in my ways, but I try really hard when I know that there's something that's upsetting my kids, or that I find out that I'm doing wrong, or that I could have done better, to try to change it moving forward.
Yeah, beautiful. And I also want to ask you just last thing. I'm doing I'm doing a presentation to some adoptive parents. I'm planning one at the moment, and the title that I came up with was navigating stormy adoptions.
Yeah.
So what would you what would be your central thread or message that I should take on board to help me shape that discussion workshop?
I think kind of what we've been talking about. Number one, um, allowing the feelings to happen, being aware of what's going on, and acknowledging um, whatever your child is feeling, and validating that it's okay to feel that way, and then evaluating, where is this coming from? What is causing you to feel this way? What is causing you to make these kinds of decisions? um, to me, that's the best way to handle any type of situation like that. What's causing this? Let's look back to the root issue. And then the second thing is to separate yourself from the issue. That whether this might, again, we all make mistakes in parenting. I mean, this goes back to your last question. We all make mistakes. We do the best we can. We do the best that we can with the knowledge that we have in the situation that we're in. And no matter what's going on right now, we can't go back. It's not necessarily useful to go back and say, oh, well, this is because we didn't discuss this when you were young. It's okay to recognize it and to say, you know what, we never discussed this when you were younger, but let's talk about it now. And maybe we should have talked about it when you were younger. That's okay, but don't ever blame yourself as a parent for that, because we do the best for our kids that we can.
Yeah.
And really, while raising adoptive kids versus biological kids, 95% of it is exactly the same. The only difference is allowing yourself the awareness to acknowledge that this could, in some way, um, be an effect of that separation, of that trauma, of that differentness, and not taking it personally, not taking that as a shortcoming as a parent. It just is. It's like if your child was in a trauma when they were young, if they were in a mass shooting event when they were young, being aware that that could be caught the root of some issues moving forward, and acknowledging that and recognizing it and moving forward from it, but not taking personal responsibility for it, because everyone's going to have some trauma in their lives, and this is one that we can't control. What's important about it is to acknowledge it and move forward from it and try and use it for
Yeah.
positive instead of negative.
What what have you learned about yourself? Because people talk a lot about, you know, modeling what they want to see in their kids. So what have you learned about allowing your own feelings so that you can model and encourage your kids to do the same?
Well, I've learned, and I've really, having kids the age that I do, I've learned a lot of this lately, because they're really quick to tell me my flaws.
Okay.
Um, I've learned to try to regulate my anger, to not yell as much, and take a step back. If I'm really upset or angry or feeling very heightened emotion, to not project that, and rather give myself time and space to experience those feelings for myself, and then move forward to address the situation without that anger as much as possible. To, you can still be unhappy that something happened and try and fix it moving forward, but to try to take the space to experience the anger on my own rather than bring that into the discussion.
Yeah. Beautiful, beautiful. And you've written a book, so tell the listeners about your book, please.
My book is called Journey to My Daughter, and it is a crazy story of how we happen to cross paths with my daughter and become a family. It I went through a lot in a very short time through our adoption story. And it was a crazy, crazy story. So I originally wrote the story for my daughter because I wanted her to know what happened. And then I was encouraged by different adoptive families when I would tell them little bits of my story and how we were so meant to be and we were so meant to find each other. And I had to go through all these trials and tribulations to get to the right child. I was encouraged to write all of this down to help other families to know that everything happens the way it's supposed to happen. So I wrote this story. It reads like a novel. It's much more a story than a nonfiction book. It reads like a novel. It's super fun to read. But my readers tell me that even though it's this super fun book to read and a great story, that it's really helped them to believe, to calm down, believe everything will happen as it should, and to be more aware of what's going on and let things happen as they're supposed to.
Brilliant. So, as always, listeners, in the show notes on the podcast, there are links to the every guest's website and their social channels. And if they've got a book, then we link to that as well. So, thank you very much, Jen. It's been a beautiful conversation, and I've learned a lot. It's really helped me because I go far from for a far more esoteric approach. So I love their logic, and I think that there's some probably balance in the middle, because a lot of this is some like the way you come up with stuff, I'm sure, is magical and intuitive and wisdom in the moment, and that's kind of like that's what's fueling and that combined with the logic and the evaluation and the calming down and the, what did you say, the validation and the validation, exploration. What was the words? What?
Evaluation.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's been great. I've really enjoyed learning about that, perhaps more step-by-step approach. Because yeah, I love it. Thank you very much.
One more thing for you is that I want to let you know for your morning walk, my audiobook is going to be published next week.
Okay, right. So we're recording this on the 27th of October. So this will probably go out after it's live, and that's great. I love audios.
Me too. Me too. That's why I had to do it, because I only listen to books on audio, and it'll be on Audible worldwide starting next week.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, listeners, and thank you, Jen. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.